I want to thank everyone for organizing this wonderful discussion on a very important topic. And to launch this topic about the importance of separation of church and state, we have Rabbi Merrill Shapiro, the immediate past national president of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. This is an amazing organization that has a long track record of fighting for religious freedom. We have Reverend James Coffin, the executive director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. Sarah Levin, program coordinator for Jews for a Secular Democracy. And Rick Gold, organizer, Gainesville Humanistic Judaism community. And I was offered to share a few words of introduction, which I shall do so at the moment. We live in a time when the separation of church and state is being threatened. And we know it's very important because in this Torah reading called Va-Dor, we have the famous statement, "Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." If that rings a bell, that's because it's on the Liberty Bell, and that's because freedom speaks with a Hebrew accent, and America cherishes its freedom, which is built on a separation of church and state. According to our founders, religion must be quarantined and not allowed to interfere with government. Religious partisanship must be masked. And if we want to achieve the vaccine against the type of tyranny that we've seen throughout history, and that the Jewish people have often been on the wrong end of, and many others as well, the vaccine against that type of tyranny, suffering, and bloodshed is the separation of church and state. And so now I will leave it to our panelists to discuss this important issue. And don't fall asleep. And don't let your rational mind be at ease, because we're going to ask you to ask questions and to offer your comments at the appropriate time. Sarah Levin, I turn it over to you and the panelists.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you so much for hosting us. And thank you, everybody, for your patience. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties today. As you can tell, I'm still a little tongue-tied from dealing with that, but we really appreciate you hosting us. And I'm going to just give you a really brief overview of Jews for Secular Democracy, why we're here, what we're trying to accomplish, and then I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished panelists to go more into the details of Christian nationalism, the role of that the Jewish community can play in separation of church and state, particularly in Florida, and bringing their personal perspectives as well to the issue. So Jews for Secular Democracy is a pluralistic initiative. We are reaching people of faith, people of no faith, everyone who values the separation of church and state as the best guarantee of protecting religious freedom for all. It's an initiative of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And what we're doing in Florida is we're really trying to have conversations like this with Jewish communities about why separation of church and state is so critical to protecting religious freedom against the kind of tyranny that the rabbi was just talking about. And how we can play an active role in advocating for these issues. And Rick, who is our lead volunteer for Jews for Secular Democracy in Florida, is going to talk a little bit about some of the legislation that we've seen in Florida that really do tie to church-state separation issues, and how moving forward, we're hoping to work with all of you to have a stronger, more cohesive Jewish voice in Florida talking about these issues. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about some of the things that we consider church-state separation issues, right? So a lot of people, when they first think about church-state separation, they might think of sort of the kind of just the symbolic issues, things like the 10 Commandments on public property, or prayer before government meetings. But it's really so much broader than that. Religion and the intrusion of religion on government has really touched on nearly every single policy area that we in U.S. policy, pretty much, whether it's taxes, military policy, healthcare, and certainly civil rights. So for sure, when you think about reproductive rights and LGBTQ rights, those are absolutely church-state separation issues, because we're seeing a very narrow set of largely Christian conservative beliefs, but really, there's a broad coalition using religious liberty arguments to justify discrimination, and often discrimination on the taxpayer's dime as well. We've seen Jews for Secular Democracy is very proud to be a partner with Americans United and other organizations, American Atheists, with Blitzwatch, which is a response to Project Blitz. Project Blitz is a Christian nationalist project that blitzes the state legislatures with legislation that advances this version of religious liberty, so-called, that actually privileges religion and a very specific, narrow set of beliefs over all others. And it starts with bills like one that passed in Florida, like mandating "In God We Trust" to be prominently displayed in all public schools. They start with issues like that because they know that it can be perceived as sort of harmless, right? You know, well, it's our national motto, what's the big deal? Well, if you look at the game plan, which thanks to journalists was made public a few years ago, so now we know what Project Blitz is and we know what their strategy is. The final stage of Project Blitz is getting the broadest possible religious exemptions from laws that apply to everybody else. You know, they want a very broad right to discriminate and to discriminate on the taxpayer's dime. So just to give you an example of that, we've seen a number of bills in different legislatures across the country that are introducing, basically saying to adoption and foster care agencies that even if you are receiving state funding, if you can receive that state funding and discriminate against a Jewish couple, against an interfaith couple, against an LGBTQ couple that is otherwise qualified to be parents or to be foster care parents, and that's perfectly fine, right? And we actually have a court case coming up really any day now in Fulton versus the city of Philadelphia, where exactly this issue is up for debate. And in that case, we have Catholic agencies that were violating the city's policy, which applied to all contractors that were providing these services, and they were found to be discriminating against LGBTQ couples. And the question that the Supreme Court is going to answer, and where a lot of church-state separation advocates are very nervous about what the results are going to be with that decision, but the question at hand is whether or not basically agencies like that are entitled to taxpayer funding, whether or not they are entitled to take taxpayer funding to provide social services that are meant to be for all tax-paying citizens, but then discriminate on the basis of religion. And we have seen that this impacts the Jewish community. It was Miracle Hill, which is a foster care agency in South Carolina, that under the Trump administration got a special waiver to be able to discriminate. And they did discriminate against a Jewish woman. They also discriminated against a Catholic woman because it was it was run by evangelical Protestants that only wanted to work with parents and volunteers that subscribe to their faith. And they were receiving state funding. So that's what I mean when I say discrimination on the taxpayer's dime. And that's really the ultimate goal, why Christian nationalism is so dangerous and why advocating strongly for church-state separation is so important. And the last thing I'll say here before I turn it over is that, you know, the Jewish people have a really unique perspective to add to this. The reason that Jews for Secular Democracy exists is because we recognize that there are, on the one hand, wonderful, fantastic national organizations like Americans United that are doing church-state separation work, but they're not doing it from an explicitly Jewish perspective. And then on the other hand, we have fantastic national organizations, Jewish organizations working on all kinds of social justice work, but not specifically from the perspective of church-state separation. And so what we're aiming to do is really to fill that gap in Florida and across the nation. And in Florida politics in particular, we're seeing that there really is a need, because we hear things, the kind of legislation that I'm talking about, justified with language like Judeo-Christian, right? Invoking the Jewish community's name to have a sort of veneer of inclusivity. But you know, we need to speak up for our community and talk about how these issues impact us, but also how they impact all religious minorities. So we really think that from the perspective of Jews, not just in the United States, but also our sort of long history of persecution as a religious minority, we really have a lot to add to the conversation. That there's, of course, a lot of partners to work with, but you can really make a difference by talking to your friends and family and engaging with us. Hopefully we'll convince you by the end of this to volunteer with Jews for a Secular Democracy, but even just having a conversation with your friends and family and peers in the Jewish community about, how can we from a Jewish perspective talk about why church-state separation is important will go a really, really long way. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Rabbi Shapiro to talk a little bit more about this. And he's going to share some slides. So give him a
just
minute.
a second. Let me share the screen. I thank you, Sarah, and thank you, and I should say, Kvod Harav Silver, and to all the good people of Va-Dor, Va-Dor. I am not so eager that you listen to me. I am eager to hear from you, and I'm eager to hear from you how it is that you continue to fund certain educational programs. I really am mystified. Here's an example. In a school not so far from Va-Dor, Va-Dor, the congregation, the synagogue, there is a school that teaches that Africa really needs religion. In fact, they use the book in the lower right-hand corner, and only 10% of Africans can read and write, and mission schools have been shut down by communists. And you are paying for that education. In fact, it's there. You can go to Seacrest Boulevard and take the St. Joseph's Episcopal School, and you can find there that this is what they are teaching, and they're using your money to do so. And they go on to say that slave masters, back in the days of slavery, obviously, were really nice guys. That's part of a curriculum from a book, and it's there again, The United States History for Christian Schools by Bob Jones University. You're paying for that to underpin the philosophy that slavery was in fact something good. That statement has been made on the floor of the Florida Senate not too long ago. Slavery was a good thing because it brought pagans from Africa to these shores to be baptized in the name of Jesus. And they're doing this with your money. You are paying for it. Now, to be fair, I'm paying for it as well. And all people in Florida are paying for it with our tax dollars, even though it's something clearly we're not so uncomfortable with. By the way, they teach that at Lake Worth Christian School on High Ridge Road in Boynton. They teach as well that the KKK was A-OK, that you're paying for that, and so am I, and so are we all. That's out of this United States History for Christian Schools. This textbook comes from Bob Jones University Press, and it says, planned targets were bootleggers, wife beaters, immoral movies. They were really a force for good. And again, they're doing so on your dime and on mine. They teach that, by the way, at this is a little further away at West Palm Beach at Okeechobee Boulevard. But that's part of the texts and part of the curriculum that you and I are paying for. You and I are also paying for a curriculum that teaches, of course, the gospel according to Matthew. And so, as you see, they teach that we, in chapter 23, that we are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets, and that we should complete what our ancestors started. We are snakes, a brood of vipers. We should be condemned to hell. Some of you will kill and crucify, others will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. You're paying for that educational program. You're paying for an educational program here that teaches the gospel according to Matthew chapter 25. That says in verse 25, the blood of Jesus is on us and our children. That is, we are all Jews, even today, responsible for deicide, for the killing of God. We're paying for a curriculum that teaches the gospel according to John. And here it says, we ultimately are we belong to our father, the devil, and carry out our father's desires. And again, I'm paying for that. you're paying for that. What I'm asking is, why is not anyone speaking up about that? Let me leave that. And so it is, we're doing so through a program called Florida's Corporate Tax Scholarship Program. I call it SCHEME, that was expanded in this past legislative session that just ended in the past few days. And it, in the end, gives credits to corporation who underwrite students financially, underwrite students who attend schools who learn these things, and they get a full tax credit for their donation to an organization that sends these students to school. And when their money does not reach the state treasury, you're paying for it, and I am paying for it. And if we are silent, we will get what we deserve. So I'm here to find out why we're doing that. Why are we not aware of how our tax dollars are being used? I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I go next, do I?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, very good. I've been introduced. Jim Coffin is my name, and I'm the director of the Interfaith Council of Central Florida. I'm a Christian, and I'm a member of Christians Against Christian Nationalism, because there are many Christians who recognize that this is a nation with a secular government. All religions are welcome, and no religion is welcome. And Christian nationalism is at odds with that. One of the organizations that has been one of the Christian organizations, I should say, that has been a great promoter of the separation of religion and state is the Baptist Joint Committee. And they are the ones who were kind of the spearheaders of this organization, Christians Against Christian Nationalism. And I'd just like to share with you what this organization teaches and the values that they espouse, because I think they're important. So this is talking from a Christian perspective. As Christians, our faith teaches that everyone is created in God's image and commands us to love one another. As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Today, we are concerned about a persistent threat to both our religious communities and our democracy, and it's called Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be Christian. It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. We reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. So here are a few things more about what Christians believe. As Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. We believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and families. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of the minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion. We must stand up and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship, against religious communities at home and abroad. Whether we worship at a church, a mosque, a synagogue, or a temple, America has no second-class faiths. All are equal under the U.S. Constitution. As Christians, we must speak with one voice in condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Christ and a threat to American democracy. And I would just conclude by saying that the writings of the New Testament, or the other Testament, talk about the what we've come to label the golden rule, and that is treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And so if we change some majority and minority roles, if Christians were in the minority and some other faith tradition or no faith tradition was in the majority, how would we want to be treated? Then it's incumbent upon us to put ourselves in the shoes of others and say, well, if that's how I'd want to be treated, then I'd better be very careful in how I treat others and treat them as I would want. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Reverend Coffin and Rabbi Shapiro. I'm Rick Gold. I am the organizer for the Gainesville Humanistic Judaism community. And I moved down to Florida about 4 or 5 years ago, and recognized that it was important for Florida Jews to have a voice dealing with separation of church and state at the state level. I think it's time that both religious and secular groups come together for this. Church-state separation is under threat by the Florida legislature, as shown by the bills that were proposed and passed in March and April. Well, some of the attacks came from politically conservative legislators inspired by President Trump. Others came from those committed to Christian nationalism. While some Jewish delegates and senators oppose separation of church and state, they represent a small minority of our community in Florida. Inspired by a history of persecution of Jews by government, most Florida Jews support separation of church and state. However, we have not yet created a statewide advocacy organization to voice these concerns. The national organization Jews for a Secular Democracy that you heard a bit about from Sarah provides a platform for those who are committed to separation of church and who oppose Christian nationalism. This platform will help us to organize ourselves statewide in a nonpartisan manner on a targeted set of issues. These issues range from protecting the right to vote, fighting prayer in public schools, protecting the requirements to teach evolution and sex education in schools, opposing government funding of religious institutions, assuring that religious liberty does not include the right to discriminate, expanding reproductive rights, and protecting LGBTQ rights. In advocating for separation of church and state and opposing efforts by Christian nationalists to impose their agenda in Florida, our network can help us use our experience, a Jewish experience, ideals, and history to ally with like-minded religious and secular groups. Together, we can stop the most egregious assaults by Christian nationalists and political conservatives on church-state separation. But over time, we can reverse the damage done and build a strong legislative commitment to separation of church and state. It's important to understand the makeup of the Florida legislature. The Florida House is controlled by legislators who are chipping away at separation of church and state and promoting Christian nationalism. The Senate is also politically conservative, but sometimes puts a brake on abusive legislation passed by the House. Until elections change the makeup of the legislature, advocates for church-state separation and who are opposed to Christian nationalism must fight negative legislation and take advantage of the few opportunities for progress on this issue. So let me tell you about some of the laws that were passed in the March to April legislative session. There was post-secondary education, which was a law that was designed to increase the opportunity for college and university students to hear politically conservative and Christian nationalist perspective. It allows students and others to intimidate professors, student governments, and university administrators who do not give these perspectives equal time. The Parents' Bill of Rights. This law states that only parents can make religious or upbringing or health decisions for their children. It gives parents the right to remove their children from sex education classes and to object to curricula based on their beliefs about morality, sex, and religion. Schools are required to get written approval from parents to provide health services, including mental health students. This requirement could prematurely out children as gay or transgender before they've chosen to come out to their parents. Then there's Safety of Religious Institutions law. This one allows concealed carry of weapons in religious buildings that also house schools, an exception to the prohibition of concealed carry in all schools. There's the moments of silence in public schools. This amends a law permitting study of the Bible and religion by requiring a moment of silence in schools. It mandates that public school teachers lead students in daily moments of reflection, a strategy used by school prayer activists to promote unconstitutional teacher-led prayer. It also requires teachers to encourage parents to discuss with their children how to use the moment of silence, which gives the teachers the opportunity to promote prayer. There's also the transgender sports ban, which was passed as a last-minute amendment to a charter school bill. It would prohibit people born biologically men from competing on women's athletics teams, and schools must verify the biological sex by reviewing the original birth certificate. A previous version of the bill required genitals of transgender athletes, but that was removed. School choice law was programs and creates educational savings accounts for public or private and religious schools. It expands the use of public funding for religious schools, and it supports religious schools that discriminate, for example, against LGBTQ students. There is also a law that regulates social media apps for censoring political or religious speech or deplatforming political candidates. And this was based on the ban of Facebook and Twitter of ex-President Trump. Curiously, it exempted the Disney company from this regulation. There were some bills that didn't pass. There was one that was prohibiting employer discrimination based on sex, another one that added crimes based on gender and gender identity to the list of prejudice-based crimes, and another one that prohibits an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity from being used as a defense to justify the conduct of the defendant. So from reading your website and listening to Rabbi Silver, I understand that Congregation Va-Dor members, like many Jews, are committed to promoting social justice and separation of church and state. Jewish advocates for separation of church and state should organize for the 2022 session of the Florida legislature. In the next year, we can develop our network, meet with and contact key legislators, support court challenges against the laws passed in the 2021 session, develop model legislation, and develop tactics for fighting legislation challenging church-state separation. In addition, you can add your name to the Jews for a Secular Democracy petition challenging the use of the term Judeo-Christian values by Christian nationalists who want legislators to believe that their policies reflect Jewish values. Finally, please add your name and email to the Google document in the chat so we can share additional information and alert you to opportunities for urgent action. Thanks so much.
Great. Rabbi Silver, you wanted to make some remarks, or did you want to go and then we'll do Q&A? Or you're on mute.
Yeah, I'll be glad to comment as we go if people have questions. I just want to let you know that I have filed quite a few lawsuits. I'm a rabbi and an attorney and a former member of the Florida legislature. I filed many lawsuits dealing with the separation of church and state, and I can assure you that I'll be filing many more. And if your fine organization would like to get involved, I'd be happy to do that. I was very interested to hear what Rabbi Shapiro said about what's being taught on the taxpayer dime. And if you need someone to file that lawsuit, I'm available to you at the drop of a yarmulke. So let's continue now. I'll be glad to field any questions if it comes up legally, and I'll offer some concluding remarks.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The first question here, I want to go to Reverend Coffin first, given that it has to do with Christian nationalism. The question is, what is the difference between white supremacy and Christian nationalism?
Some would say that there is no difference, that they're always together. I would say it would be possible to have one without the other, but I agree that typically they're together because supremacists, whether you're a Christian supremacist or a white supremacist, you know, supremacy tends to be in the blood. And so I think they usually come together, but I could conceive of a separation of them, but it's not likely.
If I may add, the events, those who recall, sadly, the march in Charlottesville upon the removal of about the removal of a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, the white supremacists walked through the area shouting, "Jews will not replace us." And that underscored our being too comfortable about this fact. The truth of the matter is that Jews, to white supremacy, Jews are not whites. Jews are not white. Jews are subject to the same kind of scrutiny as other peoples by white supremacists. Thank you.
I'd just like to share a thought that I'm sure the good Reverend Coffin would be familiar with. It says, those do not seek to remove the splinter from your neighbor's eye when you have a beam in your own eye. So I'd just like to share that Jewish scripture is the original source of supremacy, in which it says that Jews were chosen by God. Many Jews put a nice veneer on this and say, well, we were chosen to serve, which is true. But a lot of times the choosing was choosing to wipe out people who thought differently. This concept of supremacy, God choosing one group, then metastasized into Christianity and Islam. And I think it behooves all religious leaders to repudiate this notion and to replace it with the fact that each one of us can choose to be godly. We can all choose to do the right thing, but the notion that any one group of people is chosen inherently will lead to supremacy.
And that comes into nationalism in general, you know, the American exceptionalism idea. It's a form of supremacy, and it's the very kind of thing you're talking about.
So I guess to close on that point, unless that, feel free to jump in, Rick, or anyone else who wants to add. But of course, yes, can you be a Christian supremacist and not a white supremacist? Sure, but it's probably pretty rare. There are people of color that can prescribe to Christian supremacy, and there are white supremacists who maybe aren't particularly engaged in Christian supremacy. but the overlap is absolutely is large. It is very strong. And if you actually look at the, I put the link to Christians Against Christian Nationalism in the chat. And I really encourage you to read that statement of principles, because it talks about that overlap, about how merging nationalism and Christianity and the undertone, well, I should say overtones of white supremacy. It talks about that in the statement. And that statement is signed by, I think at this point, thousands, if not definitely hundreds of Christian clergy, not all of whom are necessarily left, right? This is not a left-right issue. It's really gotten broad support because of the recognition among a lot of Christian clergy that this overlap is very dangerous and needs to be called out.
But this is not a theological accident. In Jewish and Christian scripture, it approves of slavery, as we see in the chapter that we read today, Va-Dor, and it condones it. And that's why it's not a coincidence that the Deep South, which was very heavily Christian, was the hotbed of slavery. And that the more traditional somebody is in their religion and believing that God wrote the scriptures, the more likely they are to be a supremacist and to condone slavery, because they believe it was condoned by God. And so it's not an accident that this conjunction has occurred.
If I may add, that Christian supremacy often in our country is called Christian dominionism. They expect to dominate. One of the centers of Christian dominionism is right here in Florida. Although in Boynton Beach, you might not consider Pensacola and Pensacola Christian College as part of Florida. It's quite a distance away, but it is. And in Christian dominionism, they feel our country is best. The United States of America is best run and dominated by Christian thought and Christian ideals.
Thank you for answering that question really thoroughly, both to the rabbi and both rabbis and our panelists. Do we have any other questions? I haven't seen any in the chat, so please don't be shy and put your questions in the chat. If there aren't any in the chat, if you'd prefer, maybe if you're on the phone, if you prefer to unmute yourself, we can take questions that way as well. And while some of you are,
because if not, as I mentioned before, I have plenty of questions of the people, so I'll be happy to ask.
I have a question.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Yeah, based on the current political situation, as someone had mentioned earlier, the House and the Senate are overwhelmingly run by Republicans who favor religion being funded with public monies, and the governor is leading the charge. If we don't change the political situation in Florida, how are we going to change this narrative of separation of church and state?
Yeah, that's actually what I was getting at, that there always are things that you can do. You might not be successful in the short term, but you've got to be looking towards the medium and long term and thinking step by step how to get there. Now, we are a nonpartisan organization. We do not support one political party or another, but we do believe that it's important to create an environment that supports separation of church and state. And so that requires continually bringing that issue to those who represent us, helping to elect people who actually support separation of church and state, and thinking through it strategically over the short term and over the medium term to get a legislature that reflects these values. And the legislature is very supportive of the Jewish community, but at this point, that generally reflects the conservative, politically conservative side of the Jewish community. And what we're hoping to do is to bring people throughout Florida together in the Jewish community to help communicate to the legislators that the super conservative Jewish advocates that they meet with are not very representative of who the Jews are in Florida.
Following up on that, because that's a great segue into one of the other questions, which was what kind of help can we provide if we sign up to participate in Jews for a Secular Democracy? And it's really what Rick just said. There is no cohesive, and we looked into this before we even started this tour because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We were asking around to folks like Rabbi Shapiro and others, is there an existing coalition we can plug into of Jewish voices who feel this way about church-state separation? And largely the answer was no, but there needs to be one. And so, of course, it is a long game. It's a really uphill battle in a political environment like Florida, but you have to start with at least being heard, at least having a voice. And so signing up can mean a lot of different things, depending on how much time you have and your skill set and what you're interested in. But it can mean everything from joining a meeting with your legislators, either through Zoom or maybe we can look at making some trips to Tallahassee at some point, but making phone calls, writing letters to legislators, helping us reach more communities like this in your area. If you have connections with other synagogues or other Jewish community leaders, they don't have to be synagogues, where we can reach more people to have this conversation. One of the things that we can do during, not just during the legislative season, but whenever something like church-state separation issues, which comes up all the time in Florida politics comes up, we can send sign-on letters, with all, a list of Jewish community leaders. We can do petitions just to show that there is a voice, right? Because like Rick said, it's the voices that are heard from the Jewish community are largely tend to be of a more politically conservative perspective that aren't necessarily out in front supporting church-state separation. So just by organizing and helping us reaching out yourself to your own legislators, writing op-eds, writing letters to the editor in response to the issues of the day, that is our big first step, is making sure that at least the Jewish community in Florida that supports separation of church and state is heard. Because right now we can't really say that that's the case, that there's a organized, cohesive response from the Jewish community that supports church-state separation every single time a politician invokes Judeo-Christian, every single time one of these bills Rick has talked about is introduced. And we're building that. So you can, I mentioned a few specific things. You can write an op-ed, you can join. We do have regular volunteer meetings that you can join, and that's a great way to plug in. But I hope that helps answer your question about what it means to sign up. There's a lot of ways to get involved.
I'd just like to comment on what Sarah just said. I can quote Julius Caesar, who said, "I came, I saw, and I concurred." So I concur with what she's saying about the need to join this fine organization, because the other side is heavily mobilized, politicized, heavily funded. And so Jews for a Secular Democracy is needed in order to try to counter that in some way. Also, having served in the Florida legislature, and I'd have to comment on the question by my namesake. I think Barry asked this question, and he was asking about the legislature. He's correct, of course. The action is in the legislature. And I'm reminded when I served in the Florida legislature, my dad came up, who's also a rabbi, to say a blessing. And one of the legislators said, "Rabbi, are you going to say a prayer for the legislature?" He said, "No, I've been watching what you guys have been doing, and I decided it was more appropriate to say a prayer for the people of Florida." And so if you watch what's going on, you realize that if all we do is pray, we really haven't got a prayer, and that the legislature sometimes is going to be adverse, but that doesn't mean that we just give up and forget about it. There are fine organizations like this one who are fighting back. You can always fight back in court. You can fight back in the court of public opinion, and you can organize and rally to get people on your side so that we can turn things around. So nobody should get discouraged. Everyone should get involved and get mobilized, because to be an observant Jew is good, but to be an active Jew or an active Christian is even better.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabbi. I couldn't agree more with that. And something you said, I think, is also another good segue into another question we were asked. You meant with your story of, being asked to provide a prayer in the legislature. Someone asked, they said, this Thursday is National Day of Prayer. Why do you oppose this? So I'll start, but I'd love the other panelists to share their thoughts as well. So the National Day of Prayer, first of all, I think it's important to recognize the context. The kinds of organizations that that got us a National Day of Prayer, that got us a Congressional Prayer Caucus, a National Prayer Breakfast. Those are all Christian nationalist organizations. So it's that's for starters. The kinds of organizations that are pushing these kinds of things are not coming from a pluralistic perspective. Their agenda is very, very clear. Those kinds of things, these symbolic things like National Day of Prayer, are very similar to kind of what I was talking about earlier with the In God We Trust bills, right? They seem harmless. They seem, sort of just symbolic. Why should we care? But they reinforce the idea that this is a Christian nation. And they certainly do privilege religion over non-religion, and 1/4 of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. And that's the other issue with it, is that having a National Day of Prayer is basically government endorsement of prayer. And where does that leave people who don't pray? It really does leave out non-religious people who certainly reflect about things and maybe practice mindfulness, other things that are not prayer, but it really does other non-religious people. And then the last thing I'll say is that with typically, especially the way things have played out in Florida, with invocations at the local level, what ends up happening, and I should probably step back for a second for those who aren't familiar, there was a case called Town of Greece v. Galloway that the Supreme Court ruled on a number of years ago, that basically said that government meetings can begin with prayer, including sectarian prayer. But the caveat was that ostensibly, if a local city council or whatever government body is offering having invocations and having prayer that are provided by members of the community and not by the legislators themselves, as long as it is open to everyone, then that's fine. But we know that in practice, minority religions and non-religious people have regularly been shut out when they try to participate. And we have David Williamson here today also, who has done a lot of work on this at the local level with the Central Florida Free Thought community, trying to make sure that wherever there are these invocations, that non-religious people and that other religious minorities have access. But there's been a lot of resistance to that. And there are some cases, I believe, where they have been shut out, even though ostensibly with that decision, it's supposed to be pluralistic. So we know that when we have Christian nationalism is pervasive, when we know that Christian privilege is pervasive, what ends up happening with things like a day of prayer, which, ostensibly is inclusive of all people who pray, it's never inclusive of people who don't, of course. It's just like invocations. It tends to privilege and promote one specific viewpoint over others.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, that it's important to think about the value of religious freedom in the US, and it's important to celebrate that. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's our value to use religion to discriminate. And that's part of the agenda that we see is associated with the Christian nationalists, and that is celebrated at the National Day of Prayer. Have helped develop Thursday as the National Day of Reason. And I'm sure that your Rabbi Silver is very supportive of that. And I think that it just shows that it's important to have both freedom of religion and an appreciation for reason at the same time.
If I could just throw in a comment here that might give hope to those who sort of think, well, you can't make any difference. I work closely with David Williamson from the Free Thought community, And tomorrow, for example, we have an interfaith and medical program that's put on at Advent Health in Orlando called Finding Hope Amidst a Pandemic. So we have a Muslim, and we have a Catholic, and we have a humanist. And they're all talking about how their ideology, how their worldview helps them to cope. And what we have to do is get people used to the idea of seeing this diversity and seeing the inclusion. Because of what we've done there, the county of Orange County, actually when they reach out to faith leaders, it's faith and humanistic leaders. Okay, so right in their invitations that they send out, they've changed their terminology. I served on a committee, they're setting up an advisory for faith and humanistic leaders from the prosecutors, the federal prosecutor's office. And so, you know, once people start getting used to the idea and you start seeing the name and you start seeing the faces and you start hearing what's said, you know, there are a lot of people who are fence sitters who go, hey, yeah, that's right. Why didn't we include them before? So I really do think it's possible to make more impact than one might think.
If I may correct the misimpression, Greece v. Galloway was argued through the Supreme Court, up to the Supreme Court by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Government prayer at government meetings is not permitted. Prayer at government meetings is not permitted. It is permitted at legislative meetings, but your school board may not open, and we have won a handful of cases, your school board may not open with a prayer. When your meeting of the zoning commission may not begin with a prayer. The meeting of your human rights commission, if it's a government body, may not open with a prayer. Greece v. Galloway and other legal actions have also only allowed prayer in legislative, and it's called legislative prayer. So you can stand up. Let me note as well that, and I can put it up on the board, and I would urge you to consult Rabbi Silver on this issue as well, that we nonprofits are governed by the Internal Revenue Service Code section 501c3. I'll put it up if you'd like. And what the confusion is we may not engage in partisan political activities, but we may, and I would say we must, engage on issues related to government and how the government operates, which is clearly different than partisan politics. So Congregation Va-Dor Va-Dor may not approve one candidate over another, but it can speak out as a congregation on issues related to how the government operates. And when the government operates according to Christian principles, rather than the principles found in the First Amendment to the US Constitution, every congregation in the state, every congregation in the country should properly stand up. If we are silent, as we have discovered not so very long ago, if we are silent, we will get what we deserve.
Thank you.
I'd like to comment on that also. I've led many demonstrations against the National Day of Prayer. I led them when I was in the legislature, and I led them when I'm out of it. It is a classic violation of separation of church and state. It's hard to even imagine something that's more clear-cut of a violation than a National Day of Prayer led by the government. And we know that in the beginning of this country, Thomas Paine suggested that all the religions should be subsidized, all of them, so that it would be equal. And Jefferson and Washington said, no, none of them should be. And then Jefferson sent the letter to the Danbury Baptists saying that there will always be a wall of separation between church and state. And who were they worried about, the Baptists? They were worried about the Danbury Congregationalists. So we see the need for this. Now, some people say, well, what's the big deal about a prayer? You know, some people say, why are you so against a prayer? It's not that people are against a prayer. It's government-led prayer. And in Florida, I filed a lawsuit over this, and I'll continue to litigate this about In God We Trust in the schools. I'd like to see a plaque in every school saying, in reason we trust, in knowledge we trust, in science we trust, in truth we trust, in God we trust, is such a blatant violation. Teaching children to put their trust in supernatural entities rather than in themselves and knowledge and science is extremely harmful. And I'm glad to see your organization taking a stand and doing something about this. And some people say, well, what about Black History Month? You know, isn't that the same type of thing? It is not, because there's not a century-long track record of government and Blacks working together to oppress others. But we've seen what happens when government and religion comes together. We've seen it in the Inquisition, we've seen it in the Salem witch trials, we've seen it in the Crusades, we've seen it over and over again, and it's always harmful to society, and it's always horrific for Jews. And those countries today, where they are liberated from control by religion, are the most progressive, advanced, prosperous nations. And every single country where the government is entwined with religion is backwards, it's archaic, there's no tolerance, and there's no civil rights. And so we know the National Day of Prayer is an attempt to get your foot in the door, and it's something that we should oppose.
And it not only oppresses the minority, but ultimately it debilitates the majority.
Yeah.
They become weaker because of it.
And it simply is not the role of government to tell me, you, or anyone else when to pray and when not to pray. That's not the role of government. By the way, I would note, since there's a comment in the chat, that National Day of Prayer always, in modern times, takes place on the first Thursday of American Jewish Heritage Month. It takes place on the first Thursday of American Jewish Heritage Month. Congress and the president sign a proclamation proclaiming May to be American Jewish Heritage Month. So there's a Black History Month. By the way, January is Florida Jewish History Month, but May is American Jewish History Month as well. It does not change anything. By the way, it raises the important question that we understand that Judaism is not a religion and shouldn't be thought of as a religion. It'll confuse us, but we can stand up and stand against these great attempts of the government to reach in and tell us when we should pray, how we should pray, and what we should believe.
Thank you. And I'd like to just, I think you saw the same comment that I did, Rabbi, the National Day of, about the National Day of Prayer. I think it's worth sharing this if folks haven't seen it, because it puts a fine point on why something like National Day of Prayer is so problematic. So the mission of the National Day of Prayer Task Force is, quote, centered on the Lord Jesus Christ. The National Day of Prayer Task Force exists to mobilize unified public and personal prayer for America. So, I mean, there you go. It's really pretty transparent. You don't really have to go very far to see what the true agenda is of the folks who are behind these sorts of things.
But let's also be very careful about the centered on the Lord Jesus Christ, because actually you have to be part of a religious group that agrees with the Lausanne Compact, and thus Mormons, for example, the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, Mormons are not included. They're not the right kind of Christians, I suppose.
I do also want to comment on what Reverend Coffin said. You know, I'm very glad that the government doesn't try to push Judaism. That would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to the Jewish religion. If you ever got the corruption of the government pushing a certain, who knows what brand they're going to push, but they do no favors pushing Christianity. It always undermines government, and it always undermines the religion. And as far as atheists go, I just want you to know that we do an interfaith dialogue on the holiest day of the Jewish year in Yom Kippur at Congregation Va-Dor. And in that interfaith dialogue, there is always an atheist. And the atheists and I are usually doing battle against the others in debate, because we always have an atheist. And I consider atheists to be people of great faith. They have faith in reason and logic and knowledge. And so I think I agree with you to have them involved in all of these things, and to support atheists, because that is a serious form of discrimination. This discrimination against atheists. If you look at the polling, like, what would you rather have as a president? A gay, a black, a Jew, a this, a that, whoever. The atheists always come down like below everybody. And why? Because they use their mind. I mean, this is ridiculous.
And even when it comes to marriage, parents are asked, who would you least want your child to marry? And it's an atheist that,
I did want to quickly add, just to circle back to the other Barry's question earlier about the legislature. In addition to what we're talking about here and working with Jews for Secular Democracy, as Rabbi Shapiro mentioned, we as a C3, we cannot and endorse or oppose candidates for office. However, I'm sure many of you are identify with maybe a political party, and you can take the same kinds of issues that we advocate from a C3 perspective and take it to your local political committee, whatever it is, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, a Green, a Libertarian. You can advocate in partisan spaces as well. And that's a valuable place to also add your voice as a Jewish person who advocates for separation of church and state. And you can do both. You can do it in a C3 space, and you can also do it in a partisan space, and that has a whole lot of value. So especially if anyone here is involved in your local party, whatever it is, don't forget to bring your Jewish perspective on these issues in those spaces as well. We are a little bit over at 10 minutes, but we're having a great conversation here. So I just want to put it out there for if there are any other questions from the audience members or questions that Rabbi Silver, you might want to have the panel close on.
Yeah, I'd love to have the panel take a few minutes just to express some closing remarks to sum up some of the major points I'd like to make. And then I'd also like to conclude and offer my thanks for allowing us to host this wonderful discussion. So let's turn over to the panelists to offer some concluding thoughts.
How about we start with you, Rabbi Shapiro?
Okay. You know what? We have become lazy. We have not paid attention to the government that we fund with dollars that come right from our own wallets in the form of the taxes that we pay. And the government has, at the same time, been taken over by the interests who believe that Christianity is the proper religion here for our country. That, as Pat Buchanan used to say, for those of you who might be old enough to remember Pat Buchanan, the Constitution works best for Christian people, and our government works best for Christian people. We have been silent too long. We've been afraid. We are the children and grandchildren of a generation that said, Stille sein, let's be quiet and let's just not raise our heads and not stand up for it. Just let it go and we will survive. But we've come beyond that, and we need to take a step ahead of that and stand up and speak out for those who want to trample on our religious sensibilities. Thank you.
Thank you. Reverend Coffin, go ahead.
Well, I think, it comes back down to this idea of the golden rule. And the best test we can always give is if we reversed roles, if there's a different name in there. The Christian nationalism is Christian Sharia, okay? But if we talk about Muslim Sharia, then we all get panicked about it because that's them, this is us. And so we need to get used to the idea in our thinking, of kind of reversing the roles. And how would we like it if the majority is now in the minority and so on. And that gives us some insight then into what a moral person should be doing, because a moral person should be thinking of the whole of society as opposed to what's a personal advantage. Another thing that I try to emphasize is that when people say, well, you're a Christian minister, why do you do this or believe this? I go, because I'm a Christian minister. I don't do this kind of thing in spite of, I do it specifically because that's who I am.
Right, and that's a great segue, because You know, I'm organizing a Jewish community here in Gainesville, and I recognize the importance of linking education to social action, that it's not good enough to just say, these are our values, and then leave the synagogue or wherever and go home, or stay home and move on to other things from your Zoom meeting. But Congregation Lador Va-Dor has some very strong principles as provided and reinforced by the leadership of Rabbi Silver, that you think of how these can affect your opportunities to act as a congregation on issues of concern to Florida, to the US, and to humanity in general. And one of these opportunities is trying to come up with a way of promoting values of separation of church and state, and ways that will create a government that values all of us, regardless of our religion or belief. I think that since social action is a concern and interest of Congregation Lador Va-Dor, this is a great opportunity to help tap into a new group that's organizing in Florida dealing with these issues.
Great. I'll just close out by bringing your attention to action items you can take right now. So in the chat, we have a petition you can sign that stands up, it takes a stand against the weaponization of Judeo-Christian to justify the Christian nationalist agenda, because again, it's invoking the Jewish community and our values. And so we want to make sure that we're not co-opted to justify an agenda that doesn't represent our values with a veneer of inclusivity, which isn't actually inclusive. So, oh, thank you. Someone already signed it. That's great. And if you want to learn more before you sign it, I'm also putting in the chat in a moment here. We have resources where you can learn about why that phrase is so problematic, how it's being used. That's just one thing you can do right now. I also put in the chat, and so did Rick earlier, a Google spreadsheet where you can add your name, and I'm also going to put my contact information here, so you can email me. You can email me or sign up on the spreadsheet to become a volunteer and join our regular meetings and the kind of education advocacy that we're doing now and that we talked about. So I just want to encourage you all to, if you feel angry, if you feel inspired, whatever you're feeling right now, I encourage you to channel that into action and to join us in what we're doing. So thank you so much for hosting us today and hearing us out, and hopefully we'll hear from you soon and you'll join in our efforts.
Sarah, I just want to thank you and your wonderful organization, Jews for Secular Democracy. This has been a great privilege for Congregation Lador Va-Dor to host you. I had never dealt with the organization before, but I'm extremely impressed with the quality of speakers and the leadership and the activism that you're doing, especially the activism. I'm really impressed to see that, and I'm thrilled. And I encourage everyone here to get involved and support this fine organization, and also a congregation that will stand up for the separation of church and state. My father used to describe himself, he was one of the first rabbis to do interfaith weddings. He called himself an ecumaniac. They said, what's an ecumaniac? That's someone who thinks any religion is better than his own. Actually, it's time for us to realize that all religions are pathways and avenues to try to understand this creative power around us. And as far as teachings from Judaism are concerned, Moses was very modern in his approach. He was the first one to download data from the cloud onto a tablet. And he did it on 2 tablets because he believed in the binary system. And Moses was also the first one to leave his comfort zone. He was in the palace. He had everything physically and materially that anyone could have wanted. He had it all, but he was not satisfied. because other people were suffering and other people were treated unfairly. We must be willing to be followers of Moses and to create a mosaic of people from all traditions who are willing to leave our comfort zone in order to take a stand and to speak out. And how wonderful it is that this organization shows Va-Dor. We are committed to this principle and also to the idea that harming the earth is the worst form of sacrilege, and all religions must work together to save our planet. This Friday night, in our Zoom Shabbat, we will celebrate a day of reason, and we will celebrate the magnificent ability of human beings to improve and to allow religion and even our concept of God to evolve so we can come closer and closer to truth in the spirit of Isaiah, who said, "Come, let us reason together." Thank you so much for allowing reason to prevail at Congregation Va-Dor. We're deeply indebted to you.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody.